Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a little emotional to see that clip from Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha. Those were better days. There are a number of people who I would like to thank for making not only this evening possible, but my regular stays in Tucson possible. The Pozes families, of course, for supporting the Pozes series. Don and Joan Diamond, Paul and Alice Baker, Ken and Linda Robin, people whose generous support makes the program that I participate in possible. And to all of them, I am, of course, very grateful. My talk this evening on Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, their place in the New Middle East. The New Middle East that some in Israel spoke about 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, was supposed to be a new Middle East of peace that would look like the European Union. Even the European Union doesn't look like the European Union anymore. But the Middle East never became that kind of new Middle East. But we have a new Middle East now. One of total regional disarray and almost disintegration. The Arab world cannot sustain its population. Even if the civil war in Syria ends tomorrow, the Arabs will continue to emigrate. These are countries with populations that grow faster than their economies. And one doesn't have to be an economist to realize that if the populations grow faster than the economies, the standard of living is going to decline continuously. In the Arab countries, in the year 2000, all of the Arab countries together, the population was 280 million. It's now 390 million. And in the 2020s, it will be 460 million. Who will provide for these people? There is really no solution to this distress. And you have the growing of younger generations waiting for opportunities that are never going to come. People in the age group from 18 to 30 who can't even get married because they don't have jobs and the means to have a married life. This is the reality in Egypt. These are the people who rose in rebellion and overthrew Mubarak, in the belief that overthrowing Mubarak would change things, which obviously it did not. So what we see before us is what I called in an essay that I wrote already nearly 15 years ago, the decline of the Arabs. It's not even justifiable today to talk about the Middle East as the Arab world, because it isn't. The Middle East today is governed by non-Arab states: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. The rest don't count for much. The Arabs who may have had a say once in the Middle East, Egypt and Syria and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, are countries that are at different levels of struggle and failure. But in all of this complete mess, the Kingdom of Jordan for decades spoken of as a country that is bound to disappear, that it is the most artificial of all Arab states, is the most stable state in the region. Nothing has changed in Jordan in terms of the regime since that state was established by the British in 1921. The Hashemites, unless they have some really bad luck, will celebrate their centenary in 5 years' time. I don't know of too many people who in the early years of the 20th century would have thought that that was even remotely possible. People used to write frequently about King Hussein being this plucky little king, this courageous fellow whose days were numbered. Well, those who numbered his days have long gone. When Hussein rose to power, the President of the United States was Dwight Eisenhower. And when Hussein died, the President of the United States was Bill Clinton. So how come Jordan is so stable? And will it remain so? How important is this for Israel? And what does this stability or instability of Jordan mean for Israel and the Palestinians? For Israel and ISIS? For Israel and Iran? Jordan has the advantage of its small size. There are only 8 million people in Jordan. In Egypt, there are 85 million, and the population of Egypt increases by more than 1 million a year. You never have demonstrations in Jordan of 500,000 people. It's just not doable. There are not enough of them to do that. So it's a manageable country. It's a policeable country. It's a country that also can be economically bailed out relatively cheaply. But why was Jordan created at all? Here you can see the West Bank. The rest is Israel. And this is Jordan. What was originally established by the British in 1921 as Transjordan. But why was it established in the first place? There were hardly any people there. There was no such population that called themselves Jordanians. Jordan was created out of the problem of Palestine. Jordan owes its existence to the problem of Palestine. Geographically and topographically, the populated area of Jordan, which is just this, the northwestern part of the kingdom, is crisscrossed by rivers that flow from east to west and cut Jordan into different segments. The north, the center, and the south. Because of these rivers that flow from east to west, it was always difficult in ancient times to travel from south to north and from north to south, because these rivers formed deep ravines in the landscape that were difficult to cross. People tended to travel as a result from east to west and from west to east. Therefore, the people of Jordan and the people of Palestine have been linked together in family ties for thousands of years. So it was natural, when the British established the mandate for Palestine, to include Jordan in the mandate for Palestine. But the mandate for Palestine, which embraced the Balfour Declaration, which was to support the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, The British found out very quickly that the mandate for Palestine was going to be one god-awful problem between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And therefore the Jordanians, the British decided to separate Jordan from Palestine. Jordan will become an Arab state. And only in Palestine will the Jews be allowed to settle. Jordan was excluded from the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. The British believed, as the Zionists did, that very quickly hundreds of thousands of Jews, now given the opportunity, would immigrate from the poverty of Eastern Europe to Palestine. And within a short space of time, the Jews would become a majority in Palestine. And that maybe the Arabs of Palestine, not willing to live under a Jewish majority, would leave for Jordan. And Jordan would become the country that would absorb the Arabs who would no longer wish to live in Palestine. But it never came to that, because the Jews came to America and not to Palestine. And therefore the Jews never created a majority in Palestine. Even when Israel was established in 1948, the Jews were a minority in Palestine. They were only 1/3 of the population. And Jordan was established, as I say, as part of this vision of what Palestine would one day become. But Jordan wasn't much of a country. No cities, just a few towns, 250,000 people. Much of it was just desert. But it's precisely this nothingness that allowed the British and the Hashemites to turn Jordan into the stable country that they did. They could make Jordan as they saw fit, which was much more difficult to do in countries that had large urban populations, very politically motivated, etc. So a Jordanian political elite emerged, people who wanted to preserve Jordan for themselves, didn't want to be ruled by the Syrians or the Iraqis or the Palestinians. This elite had from a very early phase, and this remains true today, a powerful, loyal military and security establishment that supports the regime. The establishment, the security establishment, is based in the main on the Bedouin tribes of Jordan, the original population of Jordan, and they are, as the original Jordanians, those most loyal to the preservation of the state. So you have the elite, you have the security establishment, and the third factor is where Jordan is, its geopolitical centrality. Saudi Arabia to the south, Syria to the north, Israel and Palestine to the west, Iraq to the east. Jordan is at the very core of the Eastern Arab world. Destabilization of Jordan is destabilization of the region. And therefore external players have for decades and decades, different external players, the British, the Americans, the Israelis, the Saudis, have all at different times supported the Jordanians for the sake of regional stability. Can it last? What are Jordan's present problems? Jordan, like other Arab states, has this problem of a population growing faster than its economy. This is particularly true in recent years, where Jordan is surrounded by states that are falling apart and therefore not very good trading partners. There's not much the Jordanians can sell Syria these days, nor Iraq. Jordan has a population growth rate just over 3%, and its economy grows every year by just under 3%. So what you have in Jordan is steadily growing unemployment of particularly the younger generation. In these circumstances, Jordan has to face the ISIS problem. ISIS has not attacked Jordan head on, and it probably will not, because ISIS is under pressure in any event, and picking a fight with the Jordanian army would be inadvisable for ISIS, and therefore they haven't done so. But ISIS has a subversive capability in Jordan's young population, particularly in this situation of economic stress and widespread unemployment. And there have been serious cases of ISIS infiltration into Jordanian society. Some cases where ISIS has attacked Jordanian targets within the country. And this is a serious problem for the Jordanians, though so far they have managed it fairly well. The US and Saudi Arabia and the EU and Japan and other friendly countries provide the Jordanians with something like $2 billion a year in order to close the gap. But Jordan is struggling. And if there is a serious threat to Jordanian stability, it's economic collapse, not political opposition, but economic disarray. Why is this so important to Israel? I mean, Syria is falling apart already, and Israel is not suffering from the consequences. So why Jordan? Jordan has been Israel's best Arab neighbor. As one historian wrote, Israel and Jordan have been the best of enemies. And we were, for very many years, the best of enemies, because we had common interests, and we still have. Israel and the Zionists have never been very enthusiastic about Palestinian nationalism, but neither have the Jordanians. And the Jordanians always suspected Palestinian nationalism of challenging them on the other side of the river if they were to become too powerful in Palestine. The Jordanians were the mortal enemies of the Palestinian leadership during the British Mandate, just as the Jews were. And therefore, after the war in 1948, it was no great surprise that Jordan occupied the West Bank and Israel allowed them to do so. When the 1948 war was approaching conclusion, Israel could have taken it all, but it didn't. And it left the West Bank under Jordanian control because of all the alternatives, that was the best. To have the Palestinian leadership run a Palestinian state there would have been diametrically opposed to Israel's own self-interest. And the Jordanians called the West Bank the West Bank. It's they who gave this territory the name. It's no coincidence. Why call it the West Bank? It's Palestine. But the Jordanians didn't want to preserve the name Palestine. They wanted to de-Palestinize Palestine. And to de-Palestinize the Palestinians and incorporate them into Jordan as Jordanians. They had no interest in the Palestinian identity. Therefore, the term West Bank was invented by the Jordanians to eliminate the term Palestine. The West Bank being that companion to the East Bank on the other side of the river. The West Bank of the Jordan united with the East Bank of the Jordan. And Palestine has disappeared. After 1948, there is no place on the globe called Palestine. And it's because the Jordanians had no interest, but nor did the Israelis. Then came the war of 1967. And because of the threat of war and the dangers of war and the fact that the Jordanians did join in the war with the Egyptians against Israel, Israel took the West Bank. Taking the West Bank, however, had the effect of arresting the process of Jordanization of the Palestinians. The Jordanization of the Palestinians ended in 1967. After 1967, perhaps something the Israelis could not have known in advance. But the result of the war is that the process of Jordanization was arrested, and we have the gradual re-Palestinization of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the Palestinians return to the conflict as autonomous, independent players. And gradually the Jordanians lose the manipulative control they had over the Palestinians in the West Bank. And eventually the Palestinians in the West Bank became so anti-Jordanian that the Jordanians decided to give up the West Bank altogether. But at first, the Jordanians tried desperately to retrieve the West Bank from Israel. And there were negotiations after the war in the late 60s, early 70s, where the Jordanians wanted to get the West Bank back. But the Jordanians made Israeli full withdrawal to the 67 lines and to the repartitioning of Jerusalem a condition. The Jordanians argued, we cannot possibly convince the Arabs to support us in negotiating with Israel unless we get it all back. We can't take back 60 or 70% and leave half of Jerusalem, the Arab Jerusalem of pre-67 in the hands of Israel. So though Israel and Jordan still had their common interests, they could never agree on the details. And therefore they never arrived at an agreement on the future of the West Bank. In the early 70s, as Palestinian nationalism began to flourish, the Jordanians came to the Israelis with another idea. Let's form a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation. That is, the West Bank and Gaza will have autonomy linked to Jordan. But again, the problem was Jerusalem and the 67 boundaries. So it never happened. In 1977, in Israel, the Likud came to power. It was now the Israeli right that believed in greater Eretz Israel. Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel from 1977, made peace with Egypt in order to have a free hand in all of Eretz Israel. Therefore, for him, the so-called Jordanian option was not an option. Israel went to war against the PLO in 1982 in Lebanon, as you probably recall. The PLO was trounced in the war. The US thought that this would be a great opportunity for Israel, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to make peace with each other without the PLO, because the PLO had been so soundly defeated by the Israelis. President Reagan came to the Israelis with an offer, the Reagan Initiative, September 1982. The Reagan Initiative opposed an independent Palestinian state. It also opposed Israeli annexation. And the US suggested that Israel allow the Jordanians to create a confederation with the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel, Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, Israel's leaders of the right of those days, didn't go to war against the PLO in Lebanon in order to hand the West Bank over to the Palestinians. The whole idea of the war in Lebanon was to delete the PLO from the political equation and to give Israel a free hand in the West Bank and Gaza. In the late 80s, the stagnation in the West Bank led to the outbreak of the Palestinian uprising, the famous Intifada of the late 1980s. Because the Intifada was both anti-Israeli and anti-Jordanian, it is at this time that the Jordanians decided to disengage from the West Bank. In Israel, a Labour Party government was elected, and against the background of the Intifada, we get to the early 1980s, the early 1990s, Yitzhak Rabin becomes prime minister, and we have the Oslo Accords with the PLO. The Intifada giving the Israelis the impression that hanging on to the West Bank and Gaza forever was a project that was not viable. The Oslo process, as we know, failed, and I'll talk about exactly why it failed. But because the Oslo process began at all, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty thanks to Oslo. The Jordanians could never have signed a peace treaty without the Palestinians having a deal with Israel before. So this event that we see in Congress in 1994 is the signing of that peace treaty, which came about because the Oslo Accords liberated the PLO, liberated the Jordanians from having to consider the PLO. And what did the Jordanians and the Israelis want from this peace treaty between them? Jordan now accepted the idea of Palestinian statehood. The Jordanians in the past had been very suspicious about Palestinian statehood. And Hussein himself used to say, Jordan is Palestine, and Palestine is Jordan. And Hussein, King Hussein of Jordan, used to say that in order to argue that the creation of an organization like the PLO is redundant. We don't need them. But once the PLO was created and Palestinian nationalism began to flourish, and some began to argue amongst Israelis and elsewhere that Jordan is Palestine, and Jordan, taking the history of Jordan and its connection to Palestine, Jordan should become the Palestinian state. From then onwards, Hussein understood that for him to say Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan is not a good idea for himself. And he changed the slogan, and he changed his strategy. And it became Jordan is Jordan and Palestine is Palestine, and Jordan sincerely, and still does, sincerely want to see a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Because it is important for the Jordanians to tell the world in its entirety, Palestine is on the other side of the river. Palestine is the West Bank, not Jordan. Jordan is Jordan, forget about it. And therefore the Jordanians came to the Israelis after Oslo to come to a strategic understanding that the creation of a Palestinian state in the future would not be at Jordan's expense. And Israel needed a stable Jordan on the other side of the river to progress towards some kind of agreement with the Palestinians, which would have been a difficult affair even if it had worked. What did the Israelis want from the Jordanians? The most important clause in the treaty with Jordan is where Israel demands that Jordan not allow the stationing of any foreign forces on Jordanian soil. That is, Jordan is Israel's buffer to the east. Israel's buffer against Iraq. Israel's buffer against Iran. Jordan is Israel's buffer to the east, and therefore of considerable strategic importance to Israel itself. To keep the Arab East as far away from Israel as possible. It used to be the Iraqis. Now it's ISIS. One day it could be the Iranians. And therefore, the stability of Jordan being where it is much more important than the stability of Syria, for example, or the stability of Lebanon. Why did Oslo fail? The main reason why Oslo failed, though the Israelis intended through Oslo to establish a Palestinian state, Oslo failed because the opponents on both sides, the opponents in Israel, of whom there were many, and the opponents amongst the Palestinians were just too strong. Israel and the Palestinians, I would argue, did not agree over Oslo and will not agree to end the conflict between them in the foreseeable future. And why not? The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is very different from the conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Between Israel and the Arab states, what we have to negotiate is how do we return the territories that we took from them in the war in 1967. And if and when we agree about that, we can have a peace treaty. We did it with Egypt. We were nearly there with Syria. We've done it with Jordan. But in the question of Palestine, there are two sets of issues. Not just the 1967 issues that we have with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. With the Palestinians, we have the 1967 issues, and we have the 1948 issues. We had two great wars, 1948 and its consequences, and 1967 and its consequences. The 1967 questions is the West Bank, the settlements, Jerusalem. As difficult as these issues may be, they are the easy stuff in comparison to the 1948 questions. And what are the 1948 questions? First and foremost, the right of return of the refugees of 1948. The demand of the Palestinians that they be allowed to choose whether to return to Israel or not. And if millions of Palestinians, refugees, decide to return to Israel, Israel will no longer be what it is. And the second 1948 question relates to the definition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. 20% of Israel's population are Arabs, Palestinians. They are not Jews, and they demand that Israel cease to define itself as the nation state of the Jewish people. They argue that if Israel defines itself as the nation state of the Jewish people, that defines them out of the equation. Israel cannot answer the 1948 conundrum to the Palestinian satisfaction and remain Israel. It cannot do so. It cannot cease to define itself as the nation state of the Jewish people, because if it does, what's its purpose? After all, that is Israel's raison d'etre. And the same holds true for the refugees. Israel saw Oslo as the beginning of a process that would reduce the Palestine question just to the 1967 questions. The Palestinians, after all, elected a president in the West Bank. They also elected a parliament, and they formed the Palestinian Authority, the institutions of which were elected only by the people of the West Bank and Gaza. So the Israelis saw this as the reducing of the question of Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza. And what the Israelis wanted to do was to say to the Palestinians, okay, you take the West Bank and Gaza, or most of it. In exchange for this solution of the 1967 questions, we want you, the Palestinians, to close the 1948 file. To this, the Palestinians refused. Why wouldn't they close the 1948 file? What makes Palestinians Palestinian? 1948. The loss of Palestine makes the Palestinians Palestinian. Ethnically, they are no different to the Jordanians on the other side of the river, or to the Syrians or the Lebanese. What makes Palestinians Palestinian is not their ethnicity, but their collective memory. And the collective memory is the disaster of 1948, what the Palestinians call the Nakba. And if Israel does not address the Nakba, the disaster, there can be no resolution of the conflict with it. If you look at Palestinian documentation, Palestinian self-determination has never even once been defined as relating to the West Bank and Gaza. all PLO decisions connect the Palestinian right to self-determination to all of Palestine. When Palestinians talk about self-determination, it's never related only to the West Bank and Gaza. If you look at the wording carefully, when the Palestinians talk about the West Bank and Gaza, they never say self-determination. They say statehood or sovereignty, but not self-determination. Self-determination for the Palestinians is all of Palestine. And there is just a grudging acquiescence in the two-state idea, not because of its legitimacy, but because of the pragmatic recognition that at present nothing better is possible. But how valid is the two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians? Both Israel, officially, and the PLO agree to the two-state solution. But if you look at what the Israeli perception of two states is, and you look at the Palestinian perception of what two states is, they do not correspond with each other. For the Palestinians, two states means a state in the West Bank and Gaza and the intrusion into Israel with the refugees. It's not really two states. It's two states plus. For Israel, the Israeli concept of two states intrudes into the state of Palestine also, with Israel's security requirements. Israel demands that it have a military presence in the West Bank in the state of Palestine. Israel demands that it control the airspace of the state of Palestine. Israel demands that it have some kind of way of supervising the external borders of the state of Palestine. So the Palestinians would argue that these Israeli security requirements intrude into their state and undermine their sovereignty. So though they both speak about two states, they're not talking about the same thing. And the Israelis, in the meantime, have expanded the settlement project in the West Bank, leading more and more in the international community, including the US in recent statements, that there is no possibility for a two-state solution. That, in fact, what has emerged between Israel and the West Bank is a one-state reality. Some 400,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, hundreds of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the US and many others. There is even, one could say, a gradually emerging international consensus that the idea of two states has passed. What do the Palestinians think of the two-state idea? There are three constituencies of Palestinians: the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and the Palestinians in the diaspora, those who live in the Arab states and elsewhere. They don't have the same interests. The Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are the most interested in two states, although there too the popularity of two states is declining. But they have an interest because at least two states means the Israelis are going. For the Palestinian citizens of Israel, two states, meaningless. They still remain citizens of Israel and they're not very happy about it. Nothing changes as far as they're concerned. And if it's two states without refugee return to Israel, then for the Palestinian diaspora it's meaningless also. So you will find in the Palestinian diaspora and amongst the Arabs in Israel less support for the idea of two states. And even in the West Bank and Gaza, this is the support that once did exist is presently declining. So is there a one-state solution? Can we have one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River? If we look at the experience of other places, multi-ethnic states, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, even the Soviet Union, all of these have fallen apart. Nationalism is alive and kicking. Read Brexit, devolution in Wales, devolution in Scotland, and you're going to take the Israelis and the Palestinians and stick them in one state. You can't be serious. You just can't be serious. After 120 years at each other's throats, the solution is to take them and put them into one state, and they're going to live there happily ever after. It is unbelievable. And there is a defiance of basic logic. Here in the West, you see these supporters of the one-state idea in the universities in the United States. And the logic is as follows. Because you cannot get the Israelis to leave the West Bank, you must get the Israelis to leave their whole country. How exactly is that a logical conclusion? And the Israelis will not give up their whole country for the sake of some kind of one-state guaranteed bloodbath. Make no mistake. Those here in the US, in the campuses of the United States, who speak of a one-state solution, don't really think of a solution. For them, the one-state idea is a euphemism for the elimination of Israel, nothing else. They never talk about negotiating with the Israelis or with the Jews. They don't even talk to Israelis. So there's no element here of peacemaking in any genuine sense. It's simply making an argument that sounds reasonable in order to eliminate Israel without seeming to be very violent about it. And you have, in Israel, you have the post-Zionists of the left. Those on the far left, and there always have been some on the far left, including during the British Mandate period, who thought that there should not be a Jewish state. That establishing a state for the Jews in Palestine meant endless conflict, and therefore one should give up the idea and go for some kind of one-state reality, one-state solution. But then there are those who I call the post-Zionists of the right. Those who also give greater value and ideological support to the idea of greater Eretz Israel than to the state of Israel. That is, even if the settlements are problematic for the state of Israel, they should continue. I would say a preference for Eretz Israel above Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. And they say, Eretz Israel, Am Yisrael, Torat Israel, Medinat Israel is not there. And Israel is about Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. And there is, in this post-Zionism of the right, a challenge to the stateness of Israel. That is, even if the government and the state are opposed to establishing settlements, you establish them anyway and force them onto the government. Ben-Gurion had a principle which he called mamlachtiyut. Mamlachtiyut was stateness, the authority of the state. Mamlachtiyut, Ben-Gurionic stateness, has been seriously eroded since 1967. If you look at Jerusalem today, the knifings, the drivings over by cars, the killings of Israelis, I would say that reality is a microcosm of what the one-state reality would look like in the future. But looking at that, we also have to look at Israel's foundation and the linkage between partition and Israeli legitimacy. The state of Israel, even the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, in the minds of the international community, was always based on some form of partition. The Balfour Declaration spoke of support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. It never ever said the conversion of Palestine into a Jewish national home. The League of Nations recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land of Palestine and their right to establish a national home in Palestine. Then came the UN resolution of 1947 that partitioned Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. And in the 1947 partition, Israel agreed to what the Arabs did not agree. And Israel's independence was declared on the basis of that partition resolution, which, if you read Israel's Declaration of Independence, it draws its legitimacy from the partition resolution, amongst other things. Now we come to 2017. It is the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which was made, as you all know, in 1917. The Palestinians are waging a campaign now to denounce the Balfour Declaration and to describe the Balfour Declaration as the original sin. So we can only understand from that even though in the eyes of the international community Israel's legitimacy is based on partition, the Palestinians have never really accepted it, nor do they accept it now. You may have seen a few weeks ago a resolution passed by UNESCO denying all Jewish connection to Temple Mount. Well, if the Palestinians seek to pass resolutions like that, and then to wage a campaign against the Balfour Declaration 100 years later to denounce its illegitimacy, what should we understand about their idea of coming to terms ever with the idea of the nation state of the Jews? So in this reality, what should we do about it? Complaining and whining is not a strategy. Some people say, can't do it with the Palestinians. They have positions that they have. Let's establish a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation. So the idea of confederation is now pulled out of the drawer once again. Is it possible? Depends what you mean by that. If confederation is a way of saying the Jordanians should come and take over those parts of the West Bank that we're willing to get rid of, the Jordanians are not about to do that. The Jordanians do not have the slightest interest in running the West Bank for the Palestinians, nor do they wish to appear as co-occupiers with the Israelis. Jordanians and Palestinians do talk about confederation, but only after the creation of an independent Palestinian state. After the creation of an independent Palestinian state, the Jordanians and the Palestinians may decide to establish a confederation. But that's a different ballgame. That requires the establishment of a Palestinian state first. And as I say, that is not quite about to happen. Then there are those who still say, Jordan is Palestine. We can't fix this in Palestine. Why don't the Palestinians take Jordan? It's there. It already has a 50% and slightly more Palestinian population. It is part of historical Palestine. Well, Jordan is Palestine, and leave us alone. That is based on a number of, I would say, flawed assumptions. The Jordanians aren't going anywhere, and no one can wish them to go away. And the last who would wish them to go away are actually the Israelis. If you ask the Israeli security establishment if they would like the Jordanians to disappear, probably not. And who will replace the Jordanians on the other side of the river in this state of Palestine? People who are going to serve as a stable buffer for Israel versus ISIS. You must be joking. What common interest do they have with Israel at all? Jordan is the only Arab country that has an interest in Israel's existence. Egypt has made its peace with Israel. But if Israel were to disappear tomorrow, the Egyptians wouldn't mourn the fact they'd managed. If Israel disappears tomorrow, the Jordanians would be in serious trouble, because we and they have a lot of common interests vis-a-vis the question of Palestine. Why is there a problem with the Palestinians? Because they don't have a state? No. The problem with the Palestinians is not because they don't have a state, but it's because we do. And therefore, if they have Jordan, that is not going to satisfy them that now they have a state which they've been missing all the time. They will use Jordan as the launching pad for the fight against Israel, which will continue. The problem we have with the Palestinians is because Israel was created, not because the Palestinians don't have a state. And there is a Palestinian majority in Jordan. And so what? The king of Jordan gets up every morning to ask the majority what they want? Not quite. The Jordanians. The Palestinians have effective influence and control over the private sector, in the professional class, but in the upper echelons of the military and of the security establishment, the Palestinians are nowhere to be found. The balance of power in the state of Jordan is weighted entirely in favor of the Jordanians. And to establish the state of Palestine on the ruins of Jordan, someone will have to go in there with a lot of military force and ruin Jordan for the Palestinians. That's not about to happen. And Israel certainly won't be the contractor for such an operation. So where are we? 2 states is not presently attainable. 1 state is not a good idea. Confederation is not presently acceptable. So what are the options? We can leave things as they are. Just leave it. Leave the status quo as it is. And hope for the best. I would say that that is probably the best summary of the Israeli government's policy at present. Status quo. Just leave it as it is. Any change will only be for the worse. Then there are those in Israel who take a more proactive view, and they say Israel should annex 60% of the West Bank. Oslo divided the West Bank into 3 zones: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A and B are under almost complete Palestinian control. Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, is under Israeli control, and that's where most of the settlements are. So they say, let's annex Area C. There are hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers there. There are only 200 or 300 Palestinians there. 200, 300,000. So we could do that. That would make Israel very secure. But that would create a situation on the ground where 90% of historical Palestine belongs to Israel, and 10% belongs to the Palestinians. There are 6 million Israelis, and there are 6 million Palestinians in the former British Mandate area of Palestine. So between the river and the sea, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, the number of Israelis and the number of Palestinians is more or less equal.